Okay, welcome back to part three of my presentation to you on the legal context of sustainability, and currently in the first part still just recounting the legislation that constitutes this large body. As you know, I mean, it goes without saying, right? So President Ford takes over the presidency after Nixon's resignation in 1974, as you saw on a previous slide. In fact, some of the legislation that, we can look at that, that Nixon actually authorized, the Safe Drinking Water Act, was actually signed by Ford because Nixon had resigned from office. At any rate, we now move into the Ford administration, 1976, and we have the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. All right, so what you had was a lot of people increasingly aware of the fact that businesses in particular would have toxic wastes that they would dump, hazardous wastes that they would dump, when nobody was around. In areas which could be contaminated and hazardously so, in other words, harm human health. And so the RCRA authorized the EPA to establish regulations for hazardous wastes and to enforce those regulations, right? Any violation of dumping hazardous wastes would, again, under the command and control model, result in very, very severe penalties. There is a story, so to speak. It's not a very nice story, but a story that was made into a movie called Civil Action about a hazardous waste dumping incident in Woburn, Massachusetts. And basically there was a leather tannery there, and there were these two very large corporations supplying chemicals to that tannery and also some other materials that were used for the tannery. And one of the materials that are used at a tannery is very, very hazardous. It's an ethanol. And what they would do is they would have the employees take the stuff and dump it out sort of in the back of the factory site of the tannery. And this material would eventually wind up getting into the water supply. And tragically, a number of children died of sudden onset leukemia. And this is known as a cancer cluster. And so eventually investigations and lawsuits and all that revealed not only that these materials have been dumped, but that actually, it's a scene in the movie, these kids are sort of, these teenagers are sort of out there at night, and they're by the stream that goes by the tannery, and they're throwing firecrackers, and one of the firecrackers lands in the stream, and the stream lights up in flames because of all this highly combustible and highly hazardous chemical is actually getting into the water. More a little bit about that story later on, but again, this is a very, very important piece of legislation. Hazardous wastes, as you know, hazmats, right? I mean, there are certain hazmats that you're not allowed to truck. If you do have it on a truck, that truck has to be very, 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 very heavily regulated. One of the concerns about hazmats is accidental dumping, such as especially when you have railroads running through a particular community. In Center City, where I live in Philadelphia, we have tracks running right along the Schuylkill River, and always have big, big, freight trains coming by. And people are very concerned, not just about the oil that might spill, but also some of the hazmats that are being carried in these cars, chemicals that are otherwise used for perfectly legitimate purposes. Okay, more on the same theme, right? So the Toxic Substances Control Act, again, reporting, record keeping, and testing requirements and restrictions relating to chemical substances or mixtures. One of the things that you see down there is PCBs. PCBs were part of the chemical process for making toys and plastic things in general, and it turned out these things would be getting into the environment, getting into the landfill, getting into the soil rather, and into the water, and then not decomposing, right? And they're very, very, again, a very, very high hazardousness. You also probably recognize asbestos. Asbestos was a building and insulation material which is found to be very, very harmful to the lungs. And so removal of asbestos since 1976 has been strictly regulated by EPA. And then, of course, lead-based paint. We know what lead-based paint does to children in particular. You know, if the walls are painted with lead and it starts to peel off, and then the children, being children, start eating it, they ingest it, and then it can actually have very, very serious consequences for their intellectual development. This is probably one of the most significant pieces of legislation, and it's really the last big moment in the 1980s, and that's CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or as it is widely known, the Superfund. Hazardous wastes were dumped, they were buried legally as far back, of course, as the 19th century, during World War I, and tragically a war that was fought with chemicals. There are a lot of chemical manufacturing sites that were subsequently abandoned, and a lot of that material was left underground. World War II, the same thing, and as industrialization, manufacturing processes and the like continued, you had an increasing number of waste dumps that again could infiltrate into the soil and into the water, and of course then be ingested by human beings, particularly children. And so the whole idea behind CERCLA was to provide funding for the removal of these wastes and to actually place liability for that funding on the companies and the people who had done the dumping. Now, of course, if you're talking about World War I, I mean, many of those companies are out of business and there's no trace left anymore. And so there was a trust fund that was set up, the Superfund, basically raised from fines that were charged to dumpers and polluters that would be used to remove hazardous wastes for which no one could really any longer be held liable. So this is a huge thing. There are still a large number of Superfund sites around the country and in this very area in Delaware County. One of the things about Superfund and CERCLA that should come up at some point in this discussion is environmental justice. Environmental justice is a very large concept having to do with you know, whatever environmental impacts lower income areas is of course unjust, and that could be the construction of a highway, it could be dumping of materials, opening up a factory that would spew you know, pollutants into the air. And CERCLA, again, you know, the priority was, well, who are we gonna, what Superfund sites are we gonna clean up first, right? And of course, wealthier neighborhoods, oh my goodness, you gotta get that stuff out of here. Yeah, well, that's not fair to the people who live in the less wealthy neighborhoods, the argument would go. So that's kind of, I wanted to mention environmental justice as a sort of a larger concept, this idea that pollution is not just generally a problem for human beings, but the environmental justice movement says actually a lot of pollution disproportionately affects lower income communities. After 1980, you really don't get any more major legislation on the environment, command and control legislation. One of the reasons for that is that really it is in the beginning of the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, that you get to see hyperpartisanship, especially in Congress. The Senate changed hands a number of times in the 1980s, quite shockingly, because the Democrats had controlled the since forever, since the 1950s. But demographics and politics changed all that. A second reason for this sort of stalemate or slowdown, because the EPA had become so massive, because state and local governments had also been actively involved in regulating the environment, and because environmental legislation had been passed from pretty much every area that you could imagine. For those reasons, the partisanship, the vast administrative apparatus available to regulate the environment, and of course all the legislation covering comprehensively so many areas of environmental protection, there really was perceived to be no need for Congress to act any further. Of course, there are plenty of people who would argue there is a need for more legislation. There are also people who will argue, no, there's a need for less legislation. And we'll talk more about that in the next segment. Congress has, however, reauthorized most of the existing legislation, and that's something that's required that perhaps in passing I should mention. There's something known as a sunset provision in most legislation, saying that, well, you know, the Clean Air Act is authorized for the next 5 years. And after 5 years, then the Clean Air Act needs to be reauthorized again. The Children's Health Insurance Program has not been reauthorized. The funding for that has run out, and Congress has been unable to reauthorize that, and that's going on right now. In addition, immigration legislation has expired, and that needs to be reauthorized. So this is a process that is also applicable to environmental legislation. One of the things that environmentalists are concerned about, of course, is that as these pieces of legislation expire, a more conservative, in this case Republican government, might be reluctant to reauthorize the legislation, or to reauthorize it in a much, much weaker form. So those are just some things to keep in mind about the reauthorization process. Including, for instance, when George H.W. Bush, the first Bush presidency from 1988 to 1992, he was presented with a clean water bill that he found to be far too extensive, a reauthorization rather, to be far too extensive and expensive. And so he vetoed that legislation. Interestingly enough, his veto was overridden. I don't know if you recall, of course, that in order to override a veto, you need 2/3 of the votes in each chamber of Congress, which is a lot of votes to get, right? In the Senate, you need 66. So to override a piece of legislation would have to be bipartisan. That was a fairly significant moment. But that was a reauthorization bill of a very popular piece of legislation, as is evidenced by the fact that his veto was overridden. Okay, so sorry. When we come back, we'll be entering part 2, applying the law.